My son got engaged, and I found out from a Facebook photo while eating dinner alone. 60 people were there, her parents, their friends, his new life, everyone except me. Then I saw a comment from her aunt. "We're so happy you finally have family again." I stared at the screen, realizing my son hadn't just forgotten to invite me. He had quietly let them believe I didn't exist anymore. That night, I pulled out the deed to the duplex he'd been living in rent-free for 3 years, and the next morning, I called a realtor. 30 days later, I sold the building and handed my son a move-out notice. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 65 years old, and for nearly 40 years, I worked as a hospital billing coordinator in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of job where you don't get praised much, but you quietly keep everything running. And when my husband Daniel died 4 years ago from a sudden heart attack, the silence inside the house felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced, because for 38 years there had always been another person moving through the rooms, turning on lights, asking small questions, making ordinary days feel shared. And after he was gone, even the sound of the refrigerator humming at night felt too loud. So when my son Michael suggested moving into the downstairs unit of the duplex Daniel and I bought back in 2008, it didn't feel like I was helping him. It felt like he was helping me. And I told him he didn't need to pay rent until he got settled in his new marketing job downtown. And I remember how tightly he hugged me the day he moved in, standing in the driveway with boxes stacked behind him saying, "I'll still be right here, Mom." And for a while, he was. I'd hear his door open late at night. Sometimes he'd come upstairs for coffee before work. And on Sundays, we'd sit in the living room watching football the way we used to when Daniel was alive. And the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. But about a year later, he met Maureen, and at first I was genuinely happy because she seemed organized, confident, the kind of woman who planned her life carefully, which Michael had never really done. But the first time we met for dinner, I noticed something small. She asked Michael about his career, his plans, his future. But when I mentioned Daniel building the kitchen cabinets himself, she gave a polite smile and shifted the conversation. And I didn't think much of it at the time, but slowly things began to change. Sundays became once a month. Then quick drop-ins replaced visits. Then texts replaced conversations. And when I caught bronchitis that winter and ran a fever for 3 days, I texted Michael mostly to let him know in case something happened, and he replied hours later saying work was busy and he'd check on me the next day. But he didn't, and it was my neighbor Susan who knocked on my door with soup and checked my temperature. And I told myself people get busy, relationships change, this was normal. But I also started noticing his car parked downstairs less often, more of his belongings quietly disappearing, lights off for days at a time. And by summer, I realized he was spending most nights at Lauren's place, though he never actually said he had moved out, and I didn't ask because part of me didn't want to hear the answer. And by early fall, I realized I hadn't sat down and talked with my son in nearly 2 months, even though he still technically lived under the same roof. And what I felt wasn't just loneliness, it was something quieter, something harder to explain, like I was slowly fading from my own family, like I was being edited out of a story I had helped build. And one evening, when I saw his downstairs lights off again for the 3rd night in a row, I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, realizing I no longer knew where my own son spent most of his time. And that's when I understood something had changed long before I was ready to admit it. Because sometimes distance doesn't arrive with an argument. Sometimes it grows quietly until one day you realize you're no longer part of the life you thought you still belonged to. And looking back, I think that was the first moment I started disappearing, even though I didn't yet know how far that disappearance would go. And I'm curious, if you started feeling yourself slowly pushed out of your own child's life like this, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them early or stayed quiet like I did? And tell me, where are you watching or listening from? I read every comment. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in early October, the kind of night that usually passed without anything memorable, and I was sitting alone at my kitchen table eating leftover chicken and rice while the local news played softly in the background, the same routine I had fallen into since Daniel passed away. When I picked up my phone and opened Facebook, mostly out of habit, scrolling without really paying attention, until a photo caught my eye. A long table covered with white linens, candles glowing in tall glass holders, people dressed in cocktail attire leaning toward each other, laughing in the comfortable way of people who belong exactly where they are. And I almost kept scrolling until I noticed Michael standing in the center of the photo with his arm around Lauren, both of them smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. And my stomach tightened before my mind fully processed what I was looking at. And I tapped the photo, then swiped to the next, and the next, champagne glasses raised, a banner in the background that read engagement celebration, people hugging, clapping, someone holding a camera. And I sat there very still in my chair, my fork paused halfway to my mouth, realizing my son had gotten engaged, thrown what looked like a full celebration, and I hadn't known anything about it. And I kept scrolling, hoping maybe it was something small or spontaneous. But the more photos I saw, the clearer it became this wasn't last minute. This was planned, organized, and attended by what looked like 50 or 60 people. Lauren's parents, her relatives, friends I didn't recognize. And I started reading the comments, people congratulating them, welcoming Michael into the family. And then one comment stopped me completely. Someone wrote, "We're so glad you finally have family again." And I stared at that sentence longer than anything else, feeling something quiet settle in my chest. Because I remembered what my neighbor Susan had told me a few weeks earlier, that she ran into Michael and Lauren at the grocery store, and Lauren had mentioned he didn't really have family nearby anymore. And at the time, I assumed she meant Daniel had passed. But now, sitting there, looking at those photos, reading those comments, I realized Michael hadn't exactly lied. He had just allowed people to believe something easier, something simpler. And the realization didn't come with anger at first. It came with a strange calm, like something I had slowly sensed for months was finally clear. And I noticed something else as I kept scrolling. Not a single photo of me, not an old birthday picture, not a holiday memory, nothing that connected Michael's past to his present. And the absence felt louder than anything else. And I sat there long after the food on my plate had gone cold, staring at the screen, replaying the images, the smiles, the laughter, the life he had built without me. And that night I went to bed without turning on the lights, lying awake in the dark, thinking about all the small moments over the past year that suddenly made sense, the distance, the missed calls, the quiet fading. And around midnight I got up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out an old photo album, flipping through pictures of Michael growing up, birthdays, school events, Daniel teaching him to drive. And I realized how quickly someone can move forward while quietly leaving pieces behind. And by morning, I wasn't angry, just clear. And when I called Michael later that day and said, "Congratulations," there was a pause before he answered. And when I asked how many people attended, he said around 60. And when I asked why I hadn't known, he said he didn't want to complicate things. And when I asked if Lauren's family knew about me, he hesitated before admitting he hadn't really talked about me much. and when I hung up the phone, I stood quietly in my kitchen for a long moment, then walked to my bedroom closet, reached for the folder I hadn't opened in years, and pulled out the deed to the duplex Daniel and I bought together, reading my name printed clearly across the top. And for the first time in months, I felt something steady return. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. And I picked up my phone and scrolled to the number of the realtor Daniel and I had worked with years ago, and when he answered, I said calmly, "Hi, this is Evelyn Carter. I'm thinking about selling the building. And I want to ask you something. If you discovered your child quietly allowed people to believe you weren't part of their life anymore, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them or stepped back the way I did? And tell me, where are you watching or listening from? I read every comment." The realtor came the next morning, and when I opened the door, I felt a strange calm settle inside me, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made and there's nothing left to debate. And he walked through both units carefully, checking the updates Daniel had made over the years, the newer plumbing, the kitchen cabinets Daniel built himself, the small details that once felt like memories but now felt like assets. And he told me duplexes near downtown Dayton were moving quickly, especially ones that could be owner-occupied. And within a few days, we had multiple showings, strangers walking through the downstairs unit where Michael had lived for 3 years. And each time I watched them, I realized I wasn't acting out of anger. I was simply moving forward. And 4 days later, the realtor called, saying a retired couple relocating from Columbus wanted to make a full-price cash offer with a 30-day closing, and he explained I would need to give written notice to any occupant, even family. So that evening, I sat at the kitchen table and prepared the notice carefully, reading it twice before printing it, and then I called Michael, and when he answered, his voice sounded normal, like any other day, and I told him gently that I had accepted an offer and he would need to move out within 30 days, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had experienced before, and he finally said, You sold it?" And I answered simply, "Yes." And he said Lauren and he were planning to stay there after the wedding, and I replied quietly, "I'm sure you'll find something, or stay with Lauren." And he asked if this was because of the engagement party, and I told him no, it was because I had slowly realized I was no longer part of the life happening downstairs. And 2 days later, he showed up at my door without calling, and when I opened it, he looked tired, like he hadn't slept much, and we sat in the living room where he used to stretch out on Sundays, and he told me he had been embarrassed telling Lauren's parents he lived rent-free in his mother's duplex, that they were successful, and he wanted them to see him as independent, and he admitted he let them assume he didn't really have family support nearby, and as he spoke, I realized this wasn't about cruelty. It was about insecurity, about wanting to appear like someone he thought he needed to be, and I listened quietly before saying, "Being ashamed of where you came from doesn't make you independent, Michael. It just makes you forget who helped you get there." And he nodded slowly and told me Lauren didn't know any of this, that she was upset when he told her, and that her parents actually wanted to meet me properly. And I appreciated that, but this wasn't about introductions anymore. It was about not disappearing from my own family. And we sat quietly for a long moment, and nothing magically fixed itself. There was no sudden emotional reunion, but something honest replaced the distance, something quieter and more real. And when he stood to leave, he paused, like he wanted to say something else, then simply said he was sorry, and I nodded. And after he left, I stood at the window watching his car drive away, realizing I hadn't destroyed my son's future. I had simply stopped allowing myself to quietly fade from it. And later that afternoon, I made coffee and sat in the same chair where I had first seen those Facebook photos, but this time the house didn't feel as heavy because sometimes the hardest part isn't losing your place in someone's life, it's realizing you still have the power to reclaim it, even if things never go back to the way they were. And for the first time in months, I felt steady again, like I had remembered my own worth without needing anyone else to confirm it. And I want to ask you honestly, if you discovered your child had quietly let people believe you weren't part of their life anymore, would you have sold the property too, or handled it differently?